In today's lesson, we're going to discuss energy flow through organisms and the environment. We're going to talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, the relationships between organisms like predation and prey, food chains and food webs, and finally end with energy pyramids. So let's jump into it. Photosynthesis, you already know this from elementary school, is going to change light energy into chemical energy, but specifically it makes a sugar or a carbohydrate called glucose. The photo part of the word photosynthesis means light, and the synthesis part means to put together. So it's literally using light to put sugar together. It's built right into the name. Now, this can only be performed by organisms that have chlorophyll or some version of this chlorophyll pigment, and that would be plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. The word equation, which you must memorize, is carbon dioxide plus water using light to form glucose and oxygen. And it's to your benefit to begin to memorize the chemical formula as well. Carbon dioxide, CO2, plus the water, H2O, photons of light, or light photons. And then C6H12O6 is the formula for glucose, and of course the formula for oxygen. So please memorize this word equation and make sure you have that down pat. When we put something into a chemical equation, which is something we'll talk more about in grade 10, you call those things reactants. It's kind of like the ingredients when you're baking. Reactants are your ingredients. Then you go through the chemical process, that's what the arrow is for, and then you end up with your products at the other end. So this would be like your raw flour and your eggs, and this would be like the cake that pops out the other side. So reactants and products. So again, you've got the sunlight striking the leaves, and you've got the chlorophyll inside those leaves, and they're able to help to capture that energy. Using carbon dioxide, they go through a whole bunch of chemical reactions that you study in grade 12 biology, and they're going to end up making sugar, and then oxygen is released as a byproduct. It's so much oxygen being produced that it's more than what the plant can use for itself, which is a great benefit to the rest of us, because when the carbon dioxide goes into the leaf and the photons strike and you have the water coming in and making the sugar, all that extra oxygen leaks out and it benefits literally almost every other living organism on Earth. So again, please memorize this word equation right here. Then we've got cellular respiration. This is how organisms get their energy for all of their life functions, which was the Mrs. Grenham thing we talked about earlier. When they move and they respire and they're sensitive to the environment and they grow and they reproduce, they have nutrition requirements and excretion, and they also manufacture products. So they need to do all those things to be alive, and this is how they get their energy. And you'll notice that it is the reverse of the photosynthesis equation. Now we're going to start with glucose that was made by the plants, and we're going to use oxygen to break up that glucose and go through a whole bunch of different chemical reactions, and that will end up producing carbon dioxide gas and water and a different form of energy called ATP. This is a molecule that's very special to every cell, and these cells use this ATP in order to do all the jobs that they need for Mrs. Grenham. Okay? Now, plants and green algae are able to create the glucose for photosynthesis. Every other organism, all the other animals need to get it from their diet. So the plants themselves are also going to go through cellular respiration. They make glucose for themselves. We just have the added benefit that they make so much glucose and so much oxygen that we're able to use it as well. So you probably never thought about this before, but the actual point of eating is so that you can get glucose in your diet, because you need to be able to go through cellular respiration. The purpose of breathing is to exchange the gases. You need extra O2 to come in, and you need to get rid of the carbon dioxide that you created in cellular respiration. And then the actual purpose of urinating, among other things of trying to get rid of other waste products that your body makes, you're releasing that extra water that you've just produced. So if you never thought about it in those terms, all three of these major things that you do literally every day of your life are all for the benefit of cellular respiration. Now let's dive into the different energy relationships that we see. A lot of this will be very familiar from elementary school, so it'll be nice to have a bit of a review. Now, a producer, plants, algae, cyanobacteria, these are the organisms that can perform photosynthesis. That means that they can make their own energy, so they can make their own glucose. Producers are the most abundant type of organism on Earth, and you'll see why when we get to the energy pyramids at the end of this lesson. Now, a consumer, if you're not a producer, you can't make your own food, then you must consume or eat other organisms for energy. There are different levels of consumers. The primary level, or one with the little not symbol, primary consumers eat the producers. Secondary will eat primary consumers, and tertiary will eat, or third level, will eat secondary consumers. Depending on what you're eating, you can be primary, secondary, or tertiary. It just depends what part of the food chain you sit in. For example, humans, if you are directly eating lettuce, you are a primary consumer at that moment in time. But if you are eating a cow, so you're eating beef, the cow is the primary consumer because it ate the grass directly, and you are the secondary consumer in that sense because you are eating the cow who then ate the producer. So it just depends what particular food you're eating at that time to decide what level you're at. These can shift. For the same organism can be all of these different things depending on what it's able to eat. Okay. So speaking specifically, what do things eat? Well, of course, we've got herbivores. Now, herbivores only eat plants. You know this already. The word herb itself is actually a word meaning plant. Carnivore, carn means flesh, and that means that they're only eating meat, or maybe not meat specifically, but other consumers. So even if a bird is eating a bug, it may not be eating meat necessarily, but it's certainly eating another consumer. An omnivore, omni means all, can eat plants and animals. A scavenger eats dead animals, to be something like a crow on the side of the road when it's eating roadkill. These are eating recently killed animals, either by another animal or maybe a circumstance like it got hit by a car, or maybe it just died of old age. But either way, scavengers eat dead animals. Detritivores, this may be more of a new term, although you may have heard it in elementary school. Detritivores do the job of eating organic matter. That means that, let's jump down to decomposers. Decomposers are taking all the dead organisms and they are starting to recycle those dead organisms, and then they return the component pieces, like the carbon, back into the environment, like we talked about the other day. And they're going to break these complex molecules into simpler ones. But then the detritivores take the organic matter that was produced by the decomposers and they convert it all the way back to the starting point. So for example, denitrifying bacteria would be considered detritivores because they convert the nitrates in the soil or nitrates from the decomposing animals back into nitrogen gas. So detritivores are kind of the end of the road. Then of course we have predator versus prey, and we'll do a whole lesson on this shortly. You have a hunter, which is the predator, and it kills the other organisms for food. And of course you have the hunted or the prey, and they are being killed and eaten by other organisms. All of these different relationships are going to help us to develop food chains and food webs. Now, the arrow that you see on all of these is representing the direction that the energy is flowing in the food chain. So energy always flows from the bottom up. You start with a producer, something like a tree or seeds or grass, some kind of a plant product. You have the producer, the primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and so on. So let's just do 3 quick little examples. You have leaves on a tree. A ladybug eats the leaves, so the energy from the leaves goes into the ladybug. The ladybug then gets eaten by a frog, so the ladybug's energy goes to the frog. The frog then gets eaten by a snake, and here we have our top consumer in this particular story. Or maybe a squirrel is eating seeds or nuts from a tree, and the fox eats the squirrel, and then the lynx eats the fox. You can see what a lynx is down here in case you didn't know. Then you could have maybe grass. Rabbit eats the grass, the snake eats the rabbit, and the hawk eats the snake. Now keep in mind, we can have these chains where we're just showing one relationship at a time. But if we start to look at how maybe this chain interacts with the top chain, you can see that there's a snake in both chains. So the snake is not just eating the rabbit, it's also eating the frog. We could have drawn an arrow from the frog to the snake. Well, then that means that this line over here can also go to the hawk, and so on and so forth. When we start to draw the interrelationships between chains, then we've got ourselves a food web. So here we have a white spruce being eaten by this squirrel, being eaten by a fox, being eaten by a lynx. But that's also connected to the same tree being eaten by this bird here and then by the fox and so on. If you were to remove one of these species, let's say something happened to all of the snowshoe hares, and for some reason maybe there's a disease that came through. If you were to cross these guys out and remove them from the chain, that would put a lot more pressure on the squirrel and grouse populations to feed the red fox. So then if this guy is gone, then pretty much over time, the red squirrel and the spruce grouse, they're going to be dropping in population because the red fox is eating more of them, which means that you're actually going to see the white spruce population go up because there's less things directly eating the white spruce. So changing the one level by reducing the number of snowshoe hare, you actually affect this group over here, even though they don't directly eat or supply food to the snowshoe hare itself. Okay? That would also put pressure on the great horned owl, because if its food source is the hare and the grouse, well, if this food source is gone, you're going to see the great horned owl hunting the grouse way more often, which again would affect the amount of food available for the red fox and so on and so forth. And then, of course, because this is a food source as well as the fox to the lynx, along with the squirrels, if this is down and this is down and this is down, then that immediately affects the lynx as well. If there is a species that is so important that when it's gone, the entire web collapses, we call that a keystone species. So that's how the food webs work. And again, I'm sure you learned all about that in elementary school, but we're reviewing it here in grade 9 as well. Biodiversity is how different the species in an area are compared to one another. How many different types of plants do you have? How many different types of rodents or herbivores? How many different types of carnivores are there? How big and complex is the food web that you've got? If you've got high biodiversity, that means you have a very healthy ecosystem. That would be like saying the red fox has 10 different things it can rely on to eat. So if I lose just one of them, the red fox is still happily able to eat the rest of those 9. So high biodiversity, lots of food sources, keeps that ecosystem quite healthy. When your biodiversity drops and you start to get just one of a kind or two of a kind, now you can see that, for example, if this gray jay only eats this beetle, there's no other beetles around for it to eat because of the low biodiversity in the beetle world, then when this beetle is gone, the gray jay has no food and the gray jay will die. Then anything that relies on the gray jay will also be in trouble. So that would be a very unhealthy ecosystem. You want high biodiversity, not low biodiversity. Let's get into our last topic here, energy pyramids. Now, energy pyramids are basically a graphical way to show the amount of available energy that's passing through an ecosystem. We have a theory that says that when energy comes into an organism, so when you eat food, 60% of that is actually not usable and you actually eliminate it as waste. Only 30% of your food are you actually using for energy and to run your body, and then 10% of it gets stored in the organism's body. That means that 90% of the original energy consumed by the organism is lost or removed from the food chain because, again, it's either waste or it's used. That cannot be passed to the next level of consumers. That means there's only 10% available to pass on. So here's an example showing you 10% of each of these different levels. So let's say we start off with 10,000 joules. Remember that joule is a unit of energy that we learned about in the electricity unit. This is the amount of original energy found in this particular producer. So let's say we had grass as our producer. Then let's say the grass gets eaten by a grasshopper, so that would be a herbivore. And then the grasshopper gets eaten by a robin. So the robin is actually an omnivore. It can eat both plant products and other organisms. And then the robin gets eaten by a cat, and that would be the carnivore. Okay. Now we also have these other relationships in play. We could say that the cat is the predator to the robin, but the robin is also a predator of the grasshopper. The grasshopper is prey to the robin, and then the robin is prey to the cat. So those relationships can shift. Sometimes you can be the predator and the prey. Depends where you fit in the food chain. If you are at the top of the chain, you are the top predator, nobody else is eating you, that's a wonderful place to be. So you've got those different relationships, your primary, your secondary, and your tertiary consumers. So if the original energy in my producer, in the grass, is about 10,000 joules, only 10% of it will be available to the next consumer. So when the grasshopper goes to eat, they're only going to get 1,000 joules of the original energy produced by the plant. Then of that 1,000 joules, when the robin goes to eat the grasshopper, you've only got 100 left, and then you only have 10 left by the time the cat eats the robin. So of the original energy, look how much is lost. The fact is that if you go from the first level up to this first primary consumer, 10% of the original energy is left. By the time you take the original energy and you jump both levels to the omnivore, only 1% of the energy is left. And then when you jump all the way to the top cat, you've only got 0.1% of the original energy left. That means it's going to take a lot more omnivores, a lot more robins to feed the cat, because the cat's going to have quite a high energy level. And 10 joules through that is not enough. So that's where we'll see other types of pyramids when we try to write these out. Specifically, speaking about the pyramid of numbers down here at the bottom. Here we've got to have a lot of grass to sustain a lot of these rodents so that the snakes can have enough so that the one hawk is able to survive. So there's a massive number of producers required because there's only 10% available energy passed on to each level. So that's the basic idea of the pyramid of numbers, how many you need. Pyramid of biomass says how much mass you need, how many grams of grain you would need in order to feed enough chicken to make 50 grams of the actual human. You're going to need to eat a lot of protein, and then these chickens are going to need to eat a lot of grain in order to get that energy so that we get a little bit of muscle. And of course, this is the same as the pyramid above, where you're having the 10% drop every time you move up. And this idea here, the word trophic, just means energy level. So you have your producer, your primary consumer, your secondary consumer, tertiary, and then quaternary, which means fourth consumer on top of that. And that is the end of this lesson. Please take a look at the Google Classroom and you can see which textbook questions go along with this particular lesson.